Um, Richard, it's lovely that you're here, and thank you coming all the way from Kew to be with us. So let's start off with the big question. How do you manage to be both a biologist and a Christian? Because I think almost baked into almost every Attenborough documentary is the assumption that those two things would fight each other. Is there a conflict between being a Christian and a biologist, in your view?
Well, I have to say that within myself, I feel absolutely no conflict at all between being a biologist and being a Christian. And I think really Psalm 19 that Martha just read to us really summarizes that. You know, the first half of that psalm is about the natural world and how that speaks to God's glory. And then the second half is about the Bible. It's about God's word, isn't it? And throughout history, Christians have seen the natural world as being the book of God's works and the Bible as being the book of God's word, and have not seen there being a conflict between those two things. They are two revelations that God has given us. And so within myself, that's how I view it. And there's a real harmony between the two. Of course, there are some very interesting questions that come up, but I would view them as interesting questions to think through, rather than irresolvable conflicts between my Christianity and biology and science in general.
So if we run that a bit further, if we took Psalm 19, you've got the book of God's word, the Bible. You've also got the book of creation. So you obviously think that there is evidence for God and maybe his goodness built into creation.
Yeah, I definitely think that the natural world gives us evidence for God's existence. And throughout the ages, I think people have acknowledged this. You know, we look at the natural world, and there's amazing beauty and complexity. And as science has advanced, especially in the last 20 years, and we've begun to really understand what's going on within our cells, and the really incredible nanotechnology that we run on, this argument from design has just, to my mind, has just gathered force as we've discovered more. You know, we now understand that we have 3.2 billion letters of DNA in every cell of our body. Well, double that actually, because we have that from our mum and from our dad. And that is like
software. How many?
So 6.4 billion letters.
6.4 billion, okay.
And that's an amazingly sophisticated piece of software that we essentially run on. And now that we understand that, and you know, we know how hard it is to write software. You know, we know that the guys who write Windows software and, you know, the software for our phones are incredibly intelligent people, and they're working in a large team to be able to make something as simple as a mobile phone. But a mobile phone is simple compared to us. And so we look at that, and it's very natural to say, you know, whenever I have seen information being produced, it's been produced by an intelligent entity. I have huge amounts of information in me. Is it not logical to think that's come from an intelligent entity as well? And who would that entity be but God himself?
So that's some kind of argument for there being a design, and
absolutely.
Therefore a designer.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
So I guess the big question is, hasn't all this been explained? There's an evolutionary model that is taught in all the schools, has been around for over a century. Hasn't evolution explained it? I mean, it's in your job title, Professor of Evolutionary Genomics. That's your pronunciation of it, genomics, right? I've got the evolution bit in the title. Hasn't that all explained the whole thing away?
Well, no. I mean, we are very commonly told, oh, you know, okay, things appear to be designed, but actually they're not really designed because Darwin explained away everything. That's what someone like Richard Dawkins would say, and of course many people will say the same thing. But looking at the evidence, I really don't think that's the case. There's very many things that we really haven't even begun to explain by evolutionary processes. And if for example, you read the God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, he claims that everything has evolved and you're just stupid if you don't agree with him. But then when it really comes down to him explaining how things have evolved, it begins to get incredibly sketchy. And the fact is, for the complex nanotechnology within us, no one has even imagined an evolutionary pathway by which it could have evolved, let alone demonstrated that pathway to be true. And so I think some very, very strong claims are being made by atheists that don't really stack up when we look at the evidence of where we really are within evolutionary biology.
If I could press you on one word you've just used, nanotechnology, because to me that means little robots, and I'm in the new James Bond film. Sorry, spoiler alert. What do you mean by nanotechnology at that point? What are you looking at?
Well, yeah, I mean exactly that. Very, very tiny machines. And I'm talking incredibly tiny, so that even under a microscope you wouldn't be able to see them. But with advanced research, biologists have been able to discover the structures and the mechanisms that are causing our cells to work. And for example, within our bodies we have trillions of tiny motors, and the name for these is ATP synthase. And they're little motors that go across a membrane within our cells, and they're powered by a flow of hydrogen ions, and that causes a rotation, and that mechanical rotation is used to turn a molecule called ADP into a molecule called ATP, and that's how energy moves around in our cells. But this little turbine, ATP synthase, is a most exquisitely beautiful and efficient machine. And, you know, we do nanotechnology today. There are scientists who can build tiny nano machines, but this machine, ATP synthase, is just far beyond anything that a team of scientists could build today. And it's there throughout the whole of life. Every living thing has this motor. And so we have to ask, you know, where did that come from? How at the origin of life did we suddenly get this exquisite motor that is required for cellular life to run? I mean, that's an answer that Richard Dawkins really can't answer.
So you obviously, I mean, Christians will disagree on all sorts of things, but you obviously believe that it is possible to believe in evolution as you would wish to define it, evolution and creation, that the two aren't fighting each other.
Yes, I think it's fair to say, yeah, I believe in evolution and I believe in creation. I think there's of course, you have to ask what do we mean by those terms, because some Christians will define evolution as sort of everything they don't believe in and as being the opposite of creation. But that's not how scientists define evolution. To me as a scientist, evolution is a change in allele frequencies in populations over time. And an allele is a variant of a gene. So all evolution is the fact that over time in a population, you'll get differences in the frequency of genetic variants. So for example, you know, in the congregation here today, we have lots of genetic variation. If we produce a new generation of human beings, there'll be a slightly different frequency of black hair and blonde hair and red hair, and that's evolution. Any change in genetics over time is just in terms of the frequency of different variants, that's evolution. So of course, there's no conflict between that and creation. But some Christians would say, well, that's not evolution. But I think, well, it's not up to us to define evolution. Scientists can define evolution. And evolution is any change in gene frequencies over time. And so these things which are obviously true, we should believe in, of course. The difficulty comes when you're then saying, well, does that mechanism of evolution, changes in the frequencies of genetic variation in populations over time, does that actually explain something like the origin of this nano machine, ATP synthase? And scientifically, it's very, very difficult to make the case that it does. And so there, if I'm a Christian and I believe in God and I believe in the resurrection, it's very logical for me to say, well, I'm quite comfortable with the idea that God intervened and that God created, and their creation is an intervention by God that is different to the normal running of the natural world. It's not just the laws of physics in play. as they normally are, but God is actually doing something special at that point.
Now, there are some of us in the room who've got a scientific background. There's at least one professor, but I'm not going to call her out to embarrass her. The rest of us, if we're lucky, we watch an occasional Horizon program. So let's keep it tethered. The BBC ran an article last year, I think, on one of your concepts of Darwin's abominable mystery. Now, what is that? What is Darwin's abominable mystery?
Well, this is something that's especially interesting to me as someone working at Kew Gardens, because in 1879, Charles Darwin wrote a letter to the director of Kew Gardens, who was called Joseph Hooker. And he said the origin of the higher plants in recent geological times is an abominable mystery. He couldn't explain how it happened by his theory, because flowering plants appear very, very suddenly in the fossil record in the Cretaceous. For a very, very long time, there are only plants that don't have flowers. And then suddenly a huge diversity of plants with flowers appear in the fossil record. And Darwin knew that this didn't fit with his theory, because natural selection takes lots of time. You have to build up complexity over time, according to his theory, if it's going to work. And so this was a real puzzle to him. And the reason I got interested was I was reading around the history of what Darwin thought at the time. And I realized that, one thing I realized was that he meant something slightly different to the flowering plants. He just meant a subset of the flowering plants, because in his time, the fossil record was understood in a slightly different way, and plant taxonomy was understood in a slightly different way. So this problem of Darwin's abominable mystery has actually grown bigger over the years. He thought it was a slightly smaller problem than it is now. And that was interesting in itself, because often in the media we're just constantly told scientific progress has only proven Darwin to be correct, and every step of advancement in scientific knowledge has just shown us how right Darwin was. And actually that's not the case. If you look at some of these problems, the problems were there in Darwin's time and have actually got bigger in the ensuing 150 years. And the other really interesting thing I found when I started to explore the history of this phrase, abominable mystery, was that at the time there was a Christian who was the keeper of botany at the Natural History Museum and was a world expert on plant fossils. And interestingly, 3 years before Darwin wrote this phrase, abominable mystery, William Carruthers, this keeper at the Natural History Museum, had stood up at a meeting of the Geologists Association and basically said the origin of the flowering plants suddenly in the Cretaceous is a major problem for Darwin and fits very well with the Bible, with my views as a Christian, that God is creator. And this was very widely publicized. It was reported in the Times and in many other periodicals at the time. And embarrassingly for Darwin, he just didn't have a response, because he was corresponding with leading paleobotanists at the time, and they were all saying the same thing. And so I think this is partly why we have this slightly sort of grumpy phrase, abominable mystery, in this letter, because it's quite a bugbear for Darwin that one of his opponents is very publicly citing this as a problem, and he doesn't really have a response.
And it's still an abominable mystery.
It's still today, yeah. In some ways, it's actually grown deeper. And this, of course, is after 150 years of very intense effort to solve the mystery. So as a botanist, that's very interesting to me.
Okay. Now, they're going to go in a slightly different direction, which is also something you've written about. You've got a good website blog and with your personal stuff up there. We've put this on today because we're going through the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, and we thought, let's hit pause and really think about, is it possible to be a Christian and a scientist? But as of next week, when we're back in Genesis, Mark is going to be looking at the idea of Adam and Eve. Is that completely bonkers, genetically speaking? Did we all come from... hasn't genetics said, no, that's really utterly implausible these days?
Well, some people over the last 20 or so years have been saying it's bonkers, and that genetic variation in the human population today is so great that there's no way we could have come from a single pair, from a single couple. And Christians have listened to this and said, well, okay, we've got to give up completely on the idea of Adam and Eve. We can't all have come from a single couple. But again, looking closely at the genetic evidence, I'm not at all persuaded that that case is strong. I think that we can have all human beings coming from a single couple and still explain the genetic variation that we see around us today. Because you might think that a single couple could carry hardly any genetic variation within them, but in fact they can. Because DNA has 4 letters, 4 nucleotides that we often summarize as the letters A, T, G, and C. And in 2 human beings, you have 4 copies of the human genome. And so at every site in the human genome, you can potentially have an A, a T, a G, or a C. There's only 4 options. So a single couple could actually carry all of the genetic variation in today's population, if we're just thinking about single letter differences. And that's an amazing fact. And I'm not saying that they did carry all of the variation that we have today, because some has undoubtedly arisen since via mutation. But we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of a single pair of individuals to carry a huge amount of genetic diversity. And so I really don't think that the arguments against Adam and Eve as a pair of individuals who are the ancestors of all of us, I don't think the case against that genetically is a strong one.
That's very fascinating. And there's stuff on your blog about that, isn't there? You've done some...
Yes, there is,
You've done some videos on that.
Yeah.
And that will be of interest to some people, I'm sure. Let's land this and talk a bit more personally. What's it like being a Christian in the field of biology? Is everyone out there nasty? Are they all trying to gun for you as a Christian?
No, they're not. Obviously, there are some individuals who view biology and evolutionary biology in particular as a kind of apologetic for atheism. You know, like Richard Dawkins, for instance, a very well-known example. And of course, they are very antagonistic towards Christians. But many biologists are not like that at all. Many biologists are very interested and very open to ideas and are not vehement atheists in the way that Richard Dawkins is. I think it would be fair to say there is a bit of a shortage of Christians in biology. I think that's partly because people like Richard Dawkins are putting young Christians off of biology from a young age, which is very sad for the diversity of people going into biology. And I think another factor is, if you're a Christian at school and you're good at biology, you probably decide to become a doctor, because that's a good way of helping your fellow human beings. And for very good reasons, lots of Christian biologists become medical doctors. And that's another thing, I think, that results in few Christians being in biology. But it's not because every biologist is a Richard Dawkins.
So we've banished all the kids in the building to their groups, but we've got the parents here. Just reassure them, what difference does it make to you then? What differences does Christianity make to your... I have no idea what you do on a daily basis. I imagine you with a microscope and Petri dishes and the odd plant in a flower pot. I have no idea how an evolutionary biologist fills their day. What difference does Christianity make to your work and your approach to it?
Well, I think it's a powerful motivator. You know, if God is the creator, if the natural world is for his glory, then that gives me a real reason to want to study it, and also to want to preserve it and conserve it and not waste it and destroy it. And of course, all of my colleagues are in agreement that we need to be conserving the natural world, we need to be preventing the extinction of species, we need to be preserving biodiversity. But then when you really push them, what is the ultimate reason why they value biodiversity? Well, they might say, well, it's all we have, or because this is the only planet with life. And that, this is all true, and it does feel bad to destroy that. But I just feel that as a Christian, ultimately, because I believe that God is the creator, and God put us here for a reason, and he put the natural world here for a reason, I just feel that I have a deeper philosophical justification for wanting to preserve the natural world and protect plants from pests and diseases, etc. And without that, I think it's very easy to get quite depressed as a biologist. You know, we look at the situation in the world today, we look at environmental destruction, and one can very easily come away from that and think, well, human beings are the problem, and if only human beings just went extinct, the planet would be just so much better. And you can end up with a very negative attitude towards humans, and I've seen that in a few colleagues, and that gets very depressing. But as a Christian, I find I have a deep theological reason for wanting to preserve the natural world, but I also have a deep theological reason for valuing human beings as well as being made in God's image, and something that brings those two things together, that we're stewards of God's creation. We're, as we were singing earlier, we're tenants of the King. And so that just gives me a very coherent worldview in which to be thinking about these issues. And I just find that so helpful, you know, as we face the biodiversity crisis and things like this. Just gives me a way of thinking about it that I find very satisfying.
Thank you. Now, we're not able to open this up to Q&A, I'm afraid, in person or online, but if somebody wanted to take some of these thoughts further, is there a book you could recommend?
Well, there are lots of good books on the topic. I really like the work of John Lennox, who's a professor of maths at Oxford, and Chris actually managed to find one of his books on the bookstall here at the back.
In my study, actually.
It's called God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? It's quite a technical book, but he runs through lots of the really good arguments to show that science does not disprove God, and in fact science gives very powerful evidence for God's existence. So this book and anything by John Lennox is very well worth it.
He's a fascinating guy because he manages to write at a number of different levels. So he can write really quite easy stuff, and then he can go dive in. But he's a mathematician, that's seriously scary. One other book, folks. You may know, if you're on a church email list, you'll have had the information, but we'll send it out again. On October the 21st, we've got a little book group going, looking at Ruth Valerio's book, L is for Lifestyle. Check back in your folder if you've lost the email. We'll send the information out again, and Phil is going to be leading that discussion. But in the meantime, we're going to sing in just a second, but let's thank Richard for his time with us today. Thank you.